Hello, a very warm welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Sanam Chantier. Our guest today is Peter Harling, the founder and director of Synaps, an organization that mentors locally hired analysts and field researchers in Syria and Lebanon. Peter Harling was previously the crisis group's project director for Iraq, Lebanon and Syria. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the Islamic State group, who have very much lost a great deal of territory over the past year in both Iraq and Syria. But observers are saying that they will continue to be a threat for the coming years.
Well, they've lost territory which was, to a large extent, desert and ruins. And the cities they took control of have been thoroughly destroyed in the process of fighting against the Islamic State. So now you inherit a territory which is very difficult to rule, where people will have a very hard time to go back to, and where virtually no serious planning has been made to ensure any form of normalization. So that's your biggest problem, more than the defeat in itself. And I think the Islamic State has this ability to redeploy or to just mutate into another avatar and strike here and there.
And that takes us to the next question. Of course, the terror attacks that took place in New York earlier this week. Reportedly, the perpetrator was an Uzbek national, and the attack has been claimed by the Islamic State group. And in fact, we've seen, I think, 4 attacks on the West carried out by Uzbek nationals. Would it be, Peter, accurate to say that Muslims in Central Asia have become the new recruits for these militants?
Well, I think the Islamic State always was a bit of a misnomer in the sense that we had a relatively small militia taking control of swath of Syria and Iraq, mostly as a result of the collapse of the original power structures there, and holding their ground because they were arrayed against them, mostly aerial strikes, but few troops on the ground that could effectively move in and take over. So it's good to bear in mind that the Islamic State is very much an idea. It has an appeal to some people, but it's amorphous. It's not based on a strong ideology that would be particularly consistent and coherent. So it's something that people can turn to based on frustrations which are of all kinds, and just tap into that legitimacy and that appeal that the Islamic State has built, not least through its media savvy.
And what's interesting is, and this is rarely discussed, Peter, is of course the relatives of these fighters. I think around 5,000 women is the latest number who've given birth to the children of foreign militants. And some of them face extreme threats. Is that something that the international community, the European community, needs to be concerned about and find a solution to?
Well, not simply the children. I think we should be concerned about their parents too, and not simply the risk that they might return. I mean, many of these people are actually citizens of our own country, our own countries, and in fact, they are seen as enemies that deserve no form of pity or justice. And so we have security services chasing them down on the ground, hunting them down one after the other, and many are caught by Iraqi authorities or other militias and executed summarily, right? When I think that when we stand for our own citizens, we're not standing for particular individuals who committed crimes. We're standing for fundamental rights that apply to all, and that's the system that you really want to defend. The Islamic State has been undermining that, and I think that's one of their big victories and legacies for the future.
Talking about the future, what is the future of Syria looking like post the Islamic State group? We're talking about everything from reform to reconstruction.
Well, the Islamic State kind of came in to save us from all the dilemmas and failures we faced in the context of the Arab uprisings post-2011. We didn't really know what to do with this very difficult Syrian regime, with a collapsing power structure in Iraq. We have no means to deploy for reconstruction and so on and so forth. So we focused for the past 3 or 4 years on the Islamic State as the only topic really worthy of interest. So now that they are indeed being rooted, I think all the other issues are just resurfacing, and we're not prepared.
You say we're not prepared. Is it as gloomy for Iraq?
Well, I think in Iraq, it's a mix, because on one side, the retreat of the Islamic State, its potential defeat, is creating tension among other players, in particular between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurdish government in the northeast of the country. We could see also tensions arising from all these Shiite militias that mobilized against the Islamic State grew and have acquired significant power and gravitas and could actually run in parliamentarian elections and assume power in the country. But I think the problems we face are really about finding ways of stabilizing the situation post-victory. And here we've repeated very much the same mistake as George Bush when he invaded Iraq in 2003, focusing on the military aspects at the expense of the political landscape the day after and investments in a return to a functioning economy.
So you mentioned those Shia militia groups. There are, of course, the Kurdish population in Iraq. Now, what hope do they have for the future post the departure of Masoud Barzani, their president, and of course, a very contested referendum, something similar to which we've seen here in Europe, Spain and Catalonia, of course?
Well, the Islamic State hasn't been the only distraction used by failing polities. The referendum in Kurdistan was used by Barzani, who has since resigned from his position, but remains a strong man to be taken into account. The referendum was a way of rallying popular support in an economy that has been suffering over the past few years as a result of corruption, as a result of poor governance, and so on. So that typically was a move that was designed to take over from the war on terror, with the consequences we know. It triggered a conflict between Kurdistan and central Iraq, but also involving neighboring countries. And I think leaves everyone in a bit of a hole.
But do you think, and this is what I'm hearing from some analysts, that the reason they called this referendum was to make sure that the Kurds do have a seat around that negotiating table when it comes to the future of Iraq post the Islamic State group?
Well, it's been a long process now, taking several decades of Kurds emancipating, acquiring forms of autonomy, consolidating a local form of governance, and so on and so forth. When it comes to negotiations about the nitty-gritty sharing resources with the central government, disputed territories along the border between Kurdistan and the rest of the country, they started in 2003. Formulas were worked out over the years which were never implemented. So that's part of a host of issues which in fact have been put on hold and delayed indefinitely, and which now are just coming back to the surface.
I have to ask you this question. This is going back to Syria. France, of course, awarded the Legion of Honor to Bashar al-Assad a year after he came into power. Is it at all possible that he will be stripped of this as part of Emmanuel Macron's grand plan to clean up politics?
Well, I think France is typical of the dilemma that most European countries face. They would like the outcomes in Syria to be more convenient to them. They would like to see the regime negotiate, make concessions, reform,
So is this their concession by keeping it?
Well, I mean, it's wishful thinking. Basically, you have a regime that has pulled through, that is victorious, that feels vindicated and strong, and considers that if France, for instance, wanted to be involved in any form of reconstruction, that would be a concession from the regime to France, and not the other way around. So France now has to decide whether it's willing to be pragmatic and accommodate the power structure it believes it needs to allow Syrians back into Syria, right, and avoid having to face the refugee problem, or if it wants to continue to engineer misery by maintaining sanctions, by continuing to accuse the regime, or simply just wait for reforms that are never going to happen, right? So they have to make that decision, and in a sense, your question revolves around that.
And I want to stay with France on the new anti-terrorism laws. Do you think it is at all possible for them to be effective, considering that the state of emergency that we've had in this country for the past 2 years has not stopped a string of terror attacks from taking place?
I think that the jihadi movement has changed a great deal over the years. It used to be very ideological, so people would follow a life itinerary that would gradually lead them to forms of radicalization that left a lot of hints along the way which security services could pick up, detect early on, and act upon. Today we face forms of radicalization which are almost overnight. You can be running a bar on one day and a month later, driving into a crowd. And the frustrations that something like the Islamic State is tapping into are widespread in Kuwait, hard to define. So I think it's much more about formulating a positive agenda on what France as a society wants to be and how it can address the various problems it faces as any other society, rather than deploying all these means, which are essentially there to reassure people about the fact that the government is doing something.
I want to briefly move on to Lebanon and what is being referred to as mismanagement by the state. They are, of course, shouldering a huge part of the refugee crisis. There's a rubbish crisis, an economic crisis on their doorstep. Where are they at? Is there any hope in sight for improvement?
Well, what we're seeing in Lebanon is a political class which has failed in, as you said, numerous ways, and which is pinning the blame on refugees. And indeed, it's important to note that you have 1.5 million Syrians who moved into a very small country, where you already have 1.5 million Lebanese who happen to be poor and in need. So it's been a huge burden, and I don't think we have done quite enough to help Lebanon with that. But at the same time, the economic crisis, the garbage crisis, and so on are totally manufactured by the political elite. And it's all too convenient, I think, to blame the Syrians for it. They added a layer of complication. But, you would have to do the whole archaeology of what went wrong over years, if not decades in some cases.
One last question for you, a yes or a no if you can. Looking beyond Beirut's domestic problems, what is the likelihood of another conflict between Israel and Lebanon?
Well, it's unlikely to the extent that during the previous war in 2006, Hezbollah and Israel reached a point where they reached a form of mutually assured destruction paradigm. Whoever starts the next war will start a conflict that will be extraordinarily destructive to both. The problem is that the conflict has shifted to Syria, which is the new Lebanon. Hezbollah has moved over, has deployed assets, is very present on the ground, and there no rules of the game have been worked out. So that there's a risk of a trigger in Syria that could ultimately spill over into
On that note, we have to bring this interview to the end. Thank you very much, Peter Harling, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the interview with me, Sanam Shantier. Do stay tuned.